stolen land, a hidden fortune, and a fight for survival. Subscribe now for the full, unbelievable story. Bartholomew Bart Higgins, a man whose life was etched onto the very land he worked, felt a cold dread seep into his bones as he unfolded the crisp, official-looking document. The paper, delivered by a nervous-looking courier just hours before, proclaimed something that seemed impossible, a blatant violation of everything he held dear. 1,700 acres of his ancestral farmland, Higgins family farms, a legacy stretching back to the days when his great-great-grandfather staked his claim in this fertile valley, had been sold. The buyer? Agrimax Development, a name that rang no bells but carried the stench of corporate greed. The seller? The Harmony Creek Homeowners Association. Bart's weathered hands, calloused from years of wrestling with the earth, trembled slightly as he reread the legalese. The HOA, a collection of manicured lawns, McMansions, and meticulously enforced rules, had always been a thorn in his side. Their existence was a constant reminder of the encroaching suburban sprawl that threatened his way of life. He'd had run-ins with them before, complaints about the smell of manure, the noise of his tractors, the occasional stray cow that wandered onto their pristine golf course. But this was different. This was an outright assault. He remembered the smug face of Richard "Rick" Thompson, the HOA president, a man whose perfectly coiffed hair and expensive suits seemed utterly out of place in this rural landscape. Thompson had made no secret of his desire to acquire Bart's land, hinting at lucrative offers and mutually beneficial arrangements. Bart had always dismissed him with a grunt and a shake of his head, trusting in the sanctity of his property rights, in the legacy passed down through generations. He'd naively believed that the law and common decency would protect him. The document cited some archaic clause in the original land grant, something about communal grazing rights dating back to the 19th century. Old Man Hemlock, the local historian, a man who knew more about the valley's past than anyone alive, had mentioned it once years ago, during a casual conversation at the county fair. Bart had dismissed it as a historical curiosity, a footnote in the annals of time. Now it seemed that footnote had become the headline, a weapon wielded against him with ruthless precision. A surge of anger, hot and visceral, coursed through him. He crumpled the document in his fist, the paper crinkling like dry leaves under his grip. He had to do something. He couldn't let them get away with this. This wasn't just about land, it was about his heritage, his family, his very identity. He thought of his father, his grandfather, all the Higgins men who had poured their sweat and blood into this soil. He wouldn't let their legacy be stolen by a bunch of slick-haired city slickers. He grabbed his worn-out denim jacket and his trusty mud-splattered truck keys. The keys felt heavy in his hand, a tangible representation of his responsibility, his burden. He slammed the door of his farmhouse, the sound echoing across the empty fields. The old Ford roared to life, its engine a familiar rumble that usually soothed him. Today it sounded like a battle cry. The drive to the Harmony Creek HOA office was a blur of dust and fury. He barely registered the familiar landmarks, the old oak tree at the bend in the road, the creek where he used to fish as a boy, the rolling hills that stretched as far as the eye could see. His mind was consumed with a single burning question. How could they do this? He stormed into the HOA office, ignoring the startled receptionist who tried to intercept him. "I need to see Rick Thompson," he growled, his voice low and menacing. The receptionist, a young woman named Sarah, stammered something about an appointment, but Bart brushed past her, his boots leaving muddy tracks on the plush, beige carpet. He didn't care about their rules, their procedures, their artificial sense of order. He found Thompson in the boardroom, holding court with his usual entourage of board members. They were a collection of well-dressed, affluent-looking individuals, the kind of people who probably thought milk came from a carton and meat came wrapped in plastic. They looked up in surprise as Bart burst into the room, his presence a stark contrast to their polished surroundings. Bart slammed the crumpled document onto the polished mahogany table, the sound reverberating through the room like a gunshot. "What in the hell is this, Rick?" he demanded, his voice shaking with barely controlled rage. Thompson, ever the smooth operator, didn't even flinch. He leaned back in his leather chair, a faint smile playing on his lips. "Ah, Mr. Higgins. We were expecting you. We sent you the notice as per the legal requirements." "Legal requirements?" Bart scoffed. "You stole my land, Rick. You forged documents, twisted the law, and sold my land. The board members shifted uncomfortably in their seats, avoiding Bart's gaze. They looked like a pack of guilty dogs caught in the act. Only Thompson maintained his composure, his eyes fixed on Bart with a mixture of amusement and contempt. "It was a perfectly legitimate transaction, Mr. Higgins," Thompson said, his voice dripping with condescension. "The HOA, acting within its rights, determined that the land was underutilized and could be put to better use." "Better use?" Bart roared, his face turning a shade of red that rivaled the setting sun. "It's been feeding this valley for over a century. My family has worked that land for generations." The HOA's lawyer, a pale, nervous man named Stephen Miller, stepped forward, clutching a thick file like a shield. "Mr. Higgins," he began, his voice trembling slightly, "the original deed, dating back to 1888, contains a provision granting the community certain rights." Bart cut him off with a dismissive wave of his hand. "I don't give a damn about your legal mumbo-jumbo. You can't just take someone's land because you feel like it." He leaned closer to Thompson, his eyes blazing with righteous fury. "You've made a big mistake, Rick. A huge mistake. You think you can just waltz in here and steal my livelihood? You think you can erase my family's history? You've got another thing coming." He turned and stormed out of the boardroom, leaving the HOA board in stunned silence. The only sound was the gentle hum of the air conditioning, a stark contrast to the storm that had just raged through the room. As he walked back to his truck, a new feeling began to replace the anger: determination. He didn't know how, but he was going to fight this. He was going to get his land back. He owed it to his ancestors, to his family, to himself. And a small, almost imperceptible voice whispered in the back of his mind, he might just have an ace up his sleeve. Something the HOA hadn't considered. Something that could turn the tables completely. The drive back to the farm was different. The initial, blinding rage had subsided, replaced by a cold, calculating determination. Bart knew he couldn't just charge in guns blazing. He needed a plan, a strategy. He needed to understand how the HOA had pulled this off, and more importantly, why. He needed allies. His first stop was Old Man Hemlock's ramshackle cabin, nestled on the edge of the woods bordering Bart's property. Hemlock, a wizened old man with a memory like an elephant and a distrust of anything modern, was the unofficial historian of the valley. He knew the stories, the secrets, the hidden truths that lay buried beneath the surface of Harmony Creek. Smoke curled from Hemlock's chimney, the scent of wood smoke and something vaguely medicinal filling the air. Bart found him sitting on his porch, whittling a piece of wood with a knife that looked older than Hemlock himself. "Heard you had a run-in with the HO, Bart?" Hemlock said, his voice raspy but sharp. He didn't look up, his eyes focused on his whittling. "They stole my land, Hemlock," Bart said, his voice heavy with frustration. "Used some ancient law, some communal grazing rights thing." Hemlock chuckled, a dry, rustling sound. "Communal grazing rights, eh? That's a new one. They're getting creative, I'll give him that." He finally looked up, his eyes, the color of faded denim, piercing Bart with their intensity. "They didn't just want your land, Bart. They needed it. The question is why." Bart explained about Agrimax Development, the shadowy corporation that had bought the land. Hemlock listened intently, his brow furrowed in concentration. "Agrimax," he muttered, stroking his chin. "Never heard of, but I know someone who might." He pointed a gnarled finger towards a dusty leather-bound book on a nearby shelf. "That there's the county records going back to the founding. Land deeds, ownership transfers, the whole shebang. Might be something in there." Bart spent the next several hours poring over the ancient records, his eyes straining in the dim light of Hemlock's cabin. The handwriting was faded, the language archaic, but slowly a pattern began to emerge. He discovered that Agrimax Development was a shell corporation, registered in Delaware with no real assets or history. It was a ghost, a front for someone else. Further digging revealed a series of transactions, a complex web of shell companies and offshore accounts, all leading back to Rick Thompson. The HOA president wasn't just a greedy real estate mogul. He was a master manipulator, a puppeteer pulling the strings from behind the scenes. But why? What was so valuable about Bart's land that Thompson would go to such lengths to acquire it? The answer, Bart realized, lay not on the land but underneath it. He remembered the geological surveys that Thompson had commissioned a few years back, under the guise of environmental impact studies. Bart had dismissed them as a nuisance at the time. Now he saw them in a new light. He drove back to his farm, his mind racing. He went straight to the old well, the one his grandfather had dug back in the 1930s. He'd capped it off years ago, after switching to the county water supply. He grabbed a crowbar and, with a grunt of effort, pried the cap loose. He lowered a flashlight down the well, its beam illuminating the dark, damp depths. And then he saw it. A faint, shimmering reflection, deep down in the water. He knew instantly what it was. A vein of lithium, a highly valuable mineral used in batteries, electric cars, and a host of other modern technologies. His land wasn't just farmland, it was a potential gold mine, or rather, a lithium mine. Thompson knew this, and he had orchestrated the entire land grab to exploit it. But Bart had one more card to play, a secret weapon that Thompson hadn't anticipated. He went to his barn, to the vast, climate-controlled storage units where he kept his harvest. He looked at the mountains of produce, the fruits of his labor, and a slow smile spread across his face. He knew how to hit Thompson where it hurt the most. The HOA, with its sprawling development and hundreds of residents, was utterly dependent on Bart's farm for their food supply. He controlled the flow of fresh produce to the local supermarkets, the farmers' markets, the restaurants that served the Harmony Creek community. He was their lifeline, and they didn't even know it. The local grocery store, Pristine Produce, owned by a timid man named Harold, was completely filled with Bart's produce. He picked up his phone and dialed a number. "Harold," he said, his voice calm but firm, "I need you to do something for me." The plan was set in motion. He was going to starve them out. Bart's strategy was simple, elegant, and devastatingly effective. He wasn't going to engage in a protracted legal battle, a war of attrition that he couldn't afford. He was going to hit the HOA where they were most vulnerable, their stomachs. Harmony Creek, for all its manicured lawns and upscale amenities, was surprisingly isolated. The nearest major supermarket was a good hour's drive away, and most residents relied on the local Pristine Produce and the weekly farmers market for their groceries. And both of those outlets were almost entirely supplied by Higgins family farms. Bart had spent years cultivating relationships with Harold, the owner of Pristine Produce, and with the organizers of the farmers market. He'd always offered them fair prices, reliable deliveries, and the freshest, highest quality produce in the valley. He'd built a network of trust and dependency, a silent infrastructure that kept Harmony Creek fed. He'd never intended to use it as a weapon, but desperate times called for desperate measures. His phone call to Harold had been brief and to the point. "Harold," he'd said, his voice calm but firm, "I'm shutting down all deliveries to Pristine Produce, effective immediately. No exceptions. Don't tell anyone why, just say there's a supply chain issue." Harold, a timid man who always seemed on the verge of a nervous breakdown, had stammered and protested, but Bart had been unyielding. He knew Harold wouldn't betray him. He was too reliant on Bart's good graces, and he secretly resented the HOA's arrogance. The next day the shelves at Pristine Produce began to empty. At first it was just a few items, Bart's famous heirloom tomatoes, his crisp lettuce, his sweet corn. But soon the gaps widened. The produce section, once overflowing with vibrant colors and fresh aromas, became a desolate landscape of empty crates and wilting leftovers. Panic began to set in. Residents, accustomed to having their every culinary whim catered to, found themselves facing empty shelves and dwindling options. The HOA's social media pages, usually filled with complaints about dog barking and improperly parked cars, exploded with posts about the produce crisis. Rick Thompson, initially dismissive, soon realized the severity of the situation. He called Harold, demanding an explanation. Harold, sticking to Bart's instructions, mumbled something about unforeseen circumstances and supplier difficulties. Thompson, furious, threatened legal action, but Harold just shrugged, a newfound defiance in his eyes. The weekly farmers market, usually a bustling hub of activity, was similarly affected. Bart's stall, normally the centerpiece of the market, was conspicuously absent. Other farmers, sensing an opportunity, tried to fill the void, but they couldn't match Bart's volume or quality. The residents of Harmony Creek, used to Bart's exceptional produce, were unimpressed. The situation quickly escalated from an inconvenience to a full-blown crisis. The HOA board held an emergency meeting, the atmosphere thick with tension and recriminations. Thompson, his usually impeccable composure shattered. raged about Bart's blackmail and economic terrorism. But the board members, facing the wrath of their hungry constituents, were starting to waver. They were beginning to realize that they had underestimated the quiet farmer, the man they had dismissed as a relic of a bygone era. Bart watched the unfolding chaos from a distance, a grim satisfaction settling in his heart. He didn't enjoy seeing people suffer, but he knew he had to make his point. He had to show them that he wasn't just a farmer, he was a vital part of their community, a linchpin in their comfortable existence. He received a call from Sarah, the receptionist at the HOA office, the same woman he'd brushed past just days before. Her voice was trembling. "Mr. Higgins," she said, "Mr. Thompson wants to meet with you. He says he's willing to negotiate." Bart smiled. He'd known this was coming. He'd played his cards right and now he held all the aces. "Tell Mr. Thompson," he said, his voice calm and steady, "that I'll meet him. But not at the HOA office. Tell him to meet me at my farm. At the old well. He knows the one." He hung up the phone, the silence of the farmhouse amplifying the weight of his victory. He had them right where he wanted them. He knew the land held lithium and he controlled their access to food. The showdown was imminent and Bart was ready. He would make sure that Thompson and the entire HOA understood the true value of the land they had tried to steal, and the power of the man who worked it. The upcoming confrontation was not just about getting his land back. It was about respect, about justice, and about the enduring power of the land itself. The whispers in town and the rumors helped to cement his position. The meeting at the old well was a study in contrast. Rick Thompson, usually immaculate in his tailored suit, arrived looking disheveled and defeated. His face was pale, his eyes bloodshot, his tie askew. The arrogance that had defined him was gone, replaced by a palpable sense of desperation. Bart, on the other hand, was a picture of calm resolve. He stood by the well, his weathered hands resting on the old stone, his gaze fixed on Thompson as he approached. The HOA board members, a small, subdued group, trailed behind Thompson like chastened puppies. They had clearly lost their stomach for the fight. Even Stephen Miller, the HOA lawyer, seemed to have shrunk, his usually verbose pronouncements reduced to nervous coughs. "All right, Higgins," Thompson said, his voice hoarse and strained. "You've made your point. You've crippled us. What do you want?" Bart didn't respond immediately. He let the silence hang in the air, the only sound the gentle breeze rustling through the leaves of the nearby trees. He gestured towards the well. "You know what's down there, Rick," he said, his voice low and steady. "You've known all along." Thompson's eyes flickered with a mixture of guilt and fear. He tried to bluff, to deny it, but the words died in his throat. He knew he was caught. "The lithium," Bart continued. "That's what this was all about, wasn't it? You used that ancient law, that ridiculous, communal grazing rights clause, to steal my land to get your hands on the mineral rights." Thompson finally broke. He slumped, his shoulders sagging. "Okay, Higgins, you win. We'll rescind the sale. We'll give you back your land." Bart shook his head. "It's not that simple, Rick. You didn't just try to steal my land, you tried to destroy my livelihood, my family's legacy. You caused a lot of damage, a lot of suffering." He looked at the board members, his gaze sweeping over their faces. "And you," he said, his voice hardening, "you went along with it. You were complicit in this theft. You prioritized your own comfort, your own property values, over justice and decency." The board members shuffled uncomfortably, avoiding his eyes. They knew he was right. Bart outlined his terms. First, the sale of the 1,700 acres would be reversed, immediately and unconditionally. Second, Thompson would resign as president of the HOA, and he would be banned from holding any position of authority in the community ever again. Third, the HOA would issue a public apology to Bart and his family, acknowledging their wrongdoing and their dependence on Higgins family farms. Fourth, a substantial compensation package would be paid to Bart, to cover his legal expenses, his lost income, and the emotional distress caused by the HOA's actions. And lastly, a conservation easement would be placed on the 1,700 acres, ensuring that it would remain farmland in perpetuity, protected from any future development. Thompson, his spirit broken, agreed to all of Bart's demands. He had no choice. He knew that if he didn't, Bart could continue the food blockade, effectively starving the community into submission. He also knew that Bart could expose his illegal activities to the authorities, potentially leading to criminal charges. The agreement was signed then and there on the hood of Bart's old Ford truck. The board members, their faces etched with shame and relief, added their signatures. The nightmare was over. In the days that followed, the news of Bart's victory spread like wildfire through Harmony Creek. He was hailed as a hero, a David who had slain Goliath. The residents, realizing the extent of their dependence on his farm, flooded pristine produce and the farmer's market, buying his produce with a newfound appreciation. Thompson, disgraced and ostracized, left Harmony Creek, his reputation in tatters. The HOA underwent a complete overhaul, with new leadership committed to transparency and cooperation with the local community. Bart, however, remained unchanged. He went back to his fields, back to his quiet life, his bond with the land stronger than ever. He had won not just for himself but for his family, for his ancestors, and for the future of the valley. He had proven that even the most powerful and ruthless adversaries could be defeated, as long as you had the courage to stand up for what was right, and the wisdom to use your resources wisely. He often looked at the old well, a reminder of the battle he had fought and won. The lithium remained undisturbed, a treasure buried beneath the soil, a symbol of the land's enduring value. Bart knew he could have become a wealthy man by exploiting it, but he chose a different path. He chose to honor his family's legacy, to protect the land that had sustained them for generations. And in doing so, he had secured something far more valuable than any mineral: his peace of mind, his integrity, and the respect of his community. The sunset over Higgins family farms painted the sky in hues of orange and gold, a fitting end to a long and arduous struggle. The land was safe, and Bart Higgins, the quiet farmer who had stood up to a powerful HOA, could finally rest easy. Wow, what a story, right? If you enjoyed this incredible tale of justice and resilience, make sure you're subscribed and have notifications turned on. We bring you stories just like this, packed with twists, turns, and unforgettable characters. Don't miss out, subscribe now.